The most dangerous lie ever told about poverty is that geography is destiny. You grow up hearing it. If you were born in a frozen wasteland, you stay poor. If your land produces nothing, you starve. The soil, the climate, the latitude on a map supposedly determine everything about your future. But there is a group of men who lived on the edge of the Arctic Circle in the 17th century who proved that lie wrong. They looked at the worst geography on Earth and saw a factory. They stared at the cold that kills and saw a machine that prints money. This is not a survival story. This is the story of how worthless became priceless, how freezing air became liquid gold, and how the poorest men in Norway built an empire that controlled the food supply of an entire continent. Before we go further, just one soft reminder. You're listening to Survive to Wealth, where everything you listen to leads you toward uncovering the stories behind economic survival and transformation. Whether you're working or just relaxing, settle in and let's return to the place where ice turned into gold. Stand at the 70th parallel north in the month of January and you will understand what the word inhospitable actually means. The Lofoten Islands jut out of the Norwegian Sea like the broken teeth of a drowned giant. The mountains rise straight out of the black water, their peaks white with ancient ice. The sun, if it appears at all, crawls along the horizon for a few pale hours before sinking back into the endless night. The wind does not gust, it howls. It comes screaming down from the polar ice cap with a fury that makes wooden buildings shake and grown men weep. The temperature drops to 30 degrees below zero on the worst nights. But the cold here is different from the cold inland. This is a wet, cold, a penetrating cold that gets into your bones, no matter how many layers of wool you wrap around yourself. The sea spray freezes in midair. It coats the rocks in layers of clear ice that look like glass sculptures. Your breath turns to frost on your beard within seconds of stepping outside. Your fingers go numb inside your gloves in minutes. Frostbite is not a possibility. It is a certainty if you stay exposed too long. Yet every winter, starting in the early months of the year, thousands of men sailed to these islands. They came from the fjords of Trøndelag, from the coastal villages of Nordland, from the deep inlets of Troms. They packed their wooden chests with dried flatbread, salted meat, warm clothes, and hymnals. They kissed their wives and children goodbye, not knowing if they would return. Some would not. Every winter, men were lost to the sea, swallowed by waves the size of houses, or crushed when their boats were smashed against the rocks in sudden storms. Why did they come? Descry. These are not ordinary cod. The name comes from an Old Norse word meaning wanderer, and that is what they are. Oceanic nomads that spend most of their lives in the deep, cold waters of the Barents Sea, feeding on shrimp and smaller fish, growing massive and strong. But when the spawning urge hits them, they begin a migration that is one of the great wonders of the natural world. Millions of them, swimming hundreds of miles south and west, following currents and instincts programmed into their DNA over millions of years. They come to Lofoten because of an accident of oceanography. The Gulf Stream, that river of warm water that flows up from the Caribbean, splits as it approaches Norway. One branch curves around the islands, warming the coastal waters just enough. The temperature here in winter hovers right at the freezing point of salt water. Not so warm that the cod feel threatened. Not so cold that the water turns to solid ice. It is perfect. The squid arrive in January by the millions, desperate to spawn, fat with roe, their flesh firm and white. For the fishermen who came to harvest them, it was a blessing and a curse. The blessing was obvious. The ocean was boiling with protein. You could drop a line weighted with a simple hook and pull up fish after fish until your arms ached and your boat sat low in the water. A good crew could catch thousands of pounds in a single day. The curse was equally obvious. What do you do with all that fish? How do you preserve it? How do you turn this temporary abundance into something you can eat in the summer, when the cod are gone and your family is hungry? The men who came to Lofoten in the 1600s did not stay in comfort. They lived in structures called robur. These were not homes. They were barely even shelters. Imagine a wooden box, perhaps 30 feet long and 15 feet wide, with a single room inside, no windows. Or if there were windows, they were tiny holes covered with oiled cloth. No heating beyond a small iron stove that burned driftwood and peat. The smoke was supposed to go out through a hole in the roof, but half the time the wind blew it back down, filling the room with choking fumes. 20 men would sleep in a rowboat, not in beds, on wooden platforms built along the walls. You slept in your clothes, pressed against the bodies of your crewmates, sharing warmth because there was no other way to survive the night. The smell was indescribable. Unwashed bodies, wet wool, fish oil soaked into every surface, salt, sweat, the fermented fish guts they used as bait. You could not escape it. You breathed it. You ate it. It got into your hair and your skin and your dreams. The robu owner charged rent. Of course he did. Even here, even in this frozen hell, someone found a way to extract money from desperate men. You paid in fish, usually, a percentage of your catch. The owner also sold you supplies, rope, hooks, bait, firewood, all at inflated prices. By the time you settled your accounts at the end of the season, you were often deeper in debt than when you started. This was the trap, the cycle that kept fishermen poor generation after generation. They worked themselves to exhaustion in conditions that would break most men, and they ended the season owing money. But here is what nobody understood at first, the thing that would change everything. The climate of Lofoten, this terrible, brutal, punishing climate, was not a curse. It was the most valuable resource in Europe. The air itself was worth more than gold. They just had to figure out how to harvest it. The problem every fisherman faced was rot. Fish flesh is delicate. It spoils quickly, especially in warmer weather. The bacteria and enzymes that break down tissue work fast. Within days of being caught, a cod starts to smell. Within a week, it is inedible. Across Europe, for centuries, people had tried to solve this problem. Salting was the most common method. You packed the fish in layers of salt, which drew out the moisture and created an environment too hostile for bacteria. But salt was expensive. It had to be mined or evaporated from seawater in warm climates. By the time salt reached northern Norway, the taxes and transport costs made it worth more than the fish itself. Most fishermen could not afford it. Smoking was another option. You built a smokehouse, hung the fish inside, and kept a slow fire going for days. The smoke preserved the flesh and added flavor. But wood was scarce in many coastal areas. The trees that did grow were stunted and twisted by the wind. Driftwood was collected obsessively, but there was never enough. Smoking required constant attention. You had to tend the fires, maintain the right temperature, turn the fish. It was labor-intensive. Fermenting was used in some places. You buried the fish or stored it in barrels with just enough salt to control the bacterial growth without stopping it completely. The flesh broke down partially, developing strong flavors. Some people loved it. Others found it revolting. And fermented fish did not keep as long as salted or smoked. It was a temporary solution. Then there was the method that would change everything: drying. Not in the sun, like they did in warmer climates. Not with heat, but with cold and wind. Natural freeze drying. It sounds simple. You hang the fish on wooden racks and let nature do the work. But like all things that sound simple, the execution is everything. Getting it right required understanding the specific conditions of this place, this latitude, this combination of temperature and humidity and wind that existed nowhere else on Earth. The families in the village of Vogr were the first to truly master it. They had been fishing these waters for generations. They knew the patterns of the wind. They knew which beaches got the most consistent airflow. They knew that the period from February through April, when the sun started to return but the temperature stayed below freezing, was perfect. The fish did not rot because bacteria cannot work in freezing temperatures. But the fish did not freeze solid either, because the sun provided just enough warmth during the day and the wind kept air circulating. The moisture in the flesh was drawn out slowly, steadily, leaving behind something that was no longer fish in the way you normally think of fish. It became something else: stockfish, hard as oak, dry as bone, and practically indestructible. The Vogr families built the first great hell racks in the early 1600s. These were not small structures. They were architectural achievements. Imagine rows of wooden poles, 15 feet tall, driven deep into the rocky ground, crossbeams connecting them, more poles running horizontally. The whole thing looked like the skeleton of a massive longhouse that had been stripped of its roof and walls. But the design was precise. The spacing between poles, the height of the racks, the orientation to the prevailing winds, every measurement mattered. They discovered through trial and error that if you hung the fish too close together, moisture would get trapped between them, mold would grow, maggots would find their way in, especially when the weather warmed slightly in spring. The fish would be ruined. But if you hung them too far apart, you wasted space, and the fish would dry unevenly. The side facing the wind would cure faster than the side facing away, creating weak spots that could tear. The fish had to be prepared correctly before hanging. You cut them a specific way. Most of the time, they split the cod from the belly, removed the guts and gills, but left the head attached. The backbone stayed in. This gave the fish structure so it would hang properly. Then came the critical part: tying the knot. You passed a strong cord through the tail and looped it over the horizontal rack pole. The knot had to be tight enough that the fish would not slip, but not so tight that it crimped the flesh and restricted airflow. They developed a specific knot that became a trade secret. Boys learned it from their fathers, practicing for hours until they could tie it blind in the dark. The fish hung in pairs, tail to tail, balanced on either side of the rack pole. This distribution of weight was important. It kept the poles from bending. It also meant that air could circulate around each fish completely. The Arctic wind would flow through the racks like a river, stripping moisture from every surface. On windy days, the whole structure would hum. Thousands of dried fish hanging in rows, clattering against each other, making a sound like distant applause. It took 2 to 3 months for a fish to cure completely. You could not rush it. In the first weeks, the flesh would still be soft if you squeezed it. The eyes would cloud over and shrink. The skin would start to tighten. After a month, the fish would be noticeably lighter. Pick one up, and it felt hollow, as if the weight had somehow evaporated. By 2 months, the transformation was complete. The stockfish was rigid. You could hold it by the tail and wrap it against a wooden post, and it would make a solid thunk sound, like hitting a piece of hardwood. The smell changed too. Fresh fish smells like the ocean, briny and clean. Stockfish smells different. It has a sharp, almost ammonia-like odor from the concentration of proteins. Not unpleasant, exactly, but intense. The real magic was what happened when you rehydrated it. You took a piece of stockfish and soaked it in fresh water for several days, changing the water frequently. Slowly, gradually, the fish would absorb moisture and swell back to almost its original size. The flesh would soften. You could then cook it, and if it had been cured properly, it tasted remarkably like fresh fish. Not identical, but close enough that people who lived hundreds of miles from the ocean could eat fish that was nutritious and flavorful. The proteins were intact. The vitamins remained. You could store stockfish for years without refrigeration, ship it across oceans, carry it on military campaigns. It was the ultimate preserved food. The Vogler families realized something that would make them rich. They understood that not all stockfish was equal. Quality varied wildly depending on how it was processed. A poorly cured fish might look acceptable hanging on the rack, but when a customer tried to rehydrate it 6 months later, it would fall apart into mush. Or it would have a rancid taste from bacterial activity that had not been fully stopped. Or it would be tough and chewy, impossible to soften, no matter how long you soaked it. These inferior products flooded the market, giving stockfish a bad reputation in some places. But a perfectly cured fish, made from fresh scree, gutted immediately, hung in optimal conditions, and monitored throughout the drying process, was something else entirely. It was a premium product, and the Vogler families became obsessed with perfection. They rejected fish that had any blood spots. They rejected fish that were too small or too large. They rejected fish that had been damaged in the nets. Only the prime specimens made it onto their racks, and they watched those racks constantly. If a fish started showing signs of mold, they pulled it immediately. If the weather shifted and humidity rose, they might move fish to different racks on more exposed headlands, where the wind was stronger. This obsession with quality created a problem. It meant they could not produce as much volume as other fishermen. They were leaving money on the table by being so selective. But they had a theory. They believed that if they could build a reputation for absolute consistency, they could charge a premium that would more than make up for the lower volume. They could sell to the top of the market instead of competing with everyone else at the bottom. It was a gamble, and it required finding buyers who would appreciate the difference and pay for it. This is where the real genius appeared. The Vogel families understood that the product, no matter how good, was worthless if you sold it to the wrong people at the wrong price. Most fishermen brought their stockfish to the local merchant, who paid whatever he felt like paying. The fisherman had no leverage. He needed cash or credit for supplies. He had no way to store fish indefinitely. He had no contacts in distant markets. So he accepted the pittance offered and went home poor. The merchant then sold the fish to another merchant, who sold it to another, each one taking a cut, until by the time the fish reached the consumer in Hamburg or London, it cost 10 times what the fisherman had been paid. All the profit was captured by the middlemen. The Vogler families decided to cut out as many middlemen as possible. They needed a direct connection to the real money, and the real money was in Bergen. Bergen was not just a city. It was a machine designed to concentrate wealth. It sat on the southwestern coast of Norway, sheltered by islands and mountains, with a deep harbor that could accommodate the largest ships of the era. It was the only place where the trade from the north met the trade from the south. Everything flowed through Bergen. Stockfish came down from the Lofoten Islands and other fishing grounds. Grain, salt, wine, cloth, tools, and luxury goods came up from Germany, England, and the continent. And sitting in the middle, controlling the flow, were the Hanseatic merchants. The Hanseatic League was one of the most powerful commercial organizations in European history. It started as the loose association of German merchant guilds and grew into something close to an empire without armies. At its peak, it controlled trade across the Baltic and North Seas. It operated its own diplomatic corps. It negotiated treaties with kings. It had its own laws and courts. And it was ruthless. If a city refused to grant the Hansa favorable terms, the League would embargo it, strangling its economy until the rulers capitulated. Bergen was one of 4 major Hanseatic offices, called contours. The others were in Novgorod, Bruges, and London. But Bergen was special because it controlled one product that Europe could not do without: stockfish. The Catholic Church mandated fish on Fridays and during Lent. That was millions of people across the continent who needed fish for roughly a third of the year. Fresh fish was only available near the coast and only in season. Salted fish was an option, but it was expensive and often poor quality. Stockfish solved all these problems. It was cheap to produce, lasted forever, and when done right, tasted good. The demand was essentially infinite. The Hanseatic merchants in Bergen recognized this early. They established a trading post, a canton, on the wharf called Bryggen. By the 1400s, they dominated it completely. They owned rows of wooden buildings that stretched along the waterfront. Each building, called a tenement, was divided into multiple firms. Each firm had a manager, clerks, and workers. The buildings were painted in bright colors, red and ochre and white, with pointed roofs and small windows. They looked cheerful from a distance. Up close, you realized they were fortresses of commerce. The Germans lived in these buildings year-round. They did not integrate with the Norwegian population. They kept to themselves. They spoke German. They ate German food. They held their services at St. Mary's Church, which they essentially owned. They had their own laws and courts. If a Norwegian had a dispute with a German, he had to bring it before the Hanseatic Council, which always sided with their own. The Norwegians hated them. Local merchants felt squeezed out. Authorities resented their independence. There were riots. Occasionally, buildings were burned, people were killed, but the Germans always came back because Norway needed what they provided: grain. Northern Norway does not grow grain. The growing season is too short. The soil is too poor. The fishermen and their families lived on fish and potatoes and whatever they could forage. But you cannot survive on that alone. You need carbohydrates. You need bread. Grain had to be imported, and the Germans controlled that import. They brought wheat from England and rye from the Baltic. They set the prices. They set the terms. And they used this control as leverage to keep stockfish prices low. The system worked like this. A fisherman would arrive in Bergen with his boat loaded with dried fish. He would go to one of the Hanseatic firms on Bryggen. The manager would inspect the fish, declare it acceptable or not, and offer a price. Not in money. The Germans rarely used cash in their dealings with fishermen. They offered credit, a promise of future goods. The fisherman would receive a certificate or a mark in a ledger saying he was owed, say, 2 barrels of grain, a bag of salt, some rope, and a few tools. He would collect these items from the firm's warehouse. Then he would sail home. But here is where the trap closed. The prices the Germans set for their goods were inflated. The prices they paid for stockfish were depressed. The fisherman almost never came out even. He would end the transaction still owing the firm. This debt would carry over to the next year. The fisherman was now locked in. He had to bring his catch back to the same firm to work off his debt. And the debt, somehow, never seemed to decrease. The firm manager would always find reasons to charge more or pay less. The fisherman was caught in a cycle that he could not escape. His grandfather had owed the firm. His father had owed the firm. He owed the firm. His sons would owe the firm. It was generational bondage disguised as trade. The Germans were brilliant at this. They were meticulous record keepers. Every transaction was documented. They had ledgers going back generations, showing every deal, every debt, every payment. Their accounting was so precise that they could tell you what a specific fisherman's great-grandfather had bought in the summer of 1547. This paperwork created a kind of institutional memory that gave them enormous power. They knew everyone's financial situation. They knew who was desperate. They knew who they could squeeze. And yet, the system had cracks. It had to, because it depended on cooperation. The firms needed a steady supply of stockfish. Without it, they had nothing to sell to their customers in Europe. They could bully individual fishermen, but if the fishermen as a group decided to boycott Bergen and sell elsewhere, the Germans would be ruined. So they had to maintain some level of fairness. They had to keep the fishermen alive and functional. It was a delicate balance. This balance is what the Vogel families decided to exploit. They understood that not all German firms were the same. Most were large, established operations run by cautious managers who followed procedures set by owners back in Lübeck. But there were younger firms, ambitious operations run by men who wanted to make their name and fortune quickly. These managers had more flexibility. They could take risks. They were hungry. Thorald, the patriarch of the leading Vogel family, identified one such manager. His name was Klaus. He was in his 30s, managing a small firm that his father had established. Klaus was smart. He spoke some Norwegian, which was rare among the Germans. He had traveled to Lübeck and seeing how the stockfish market worked there. He knew that high-quality fish commanded premium prices. He also knew that his firm was stuck in a rut, buying mediocre fish from struggling fishermen and selling it at mediocre prices. He wanted to break out. Thorwalds approached Klaus not as a supplicant, but as a partner. He did not arrive cap in hand, begging for fair terms. He came with a proposal. He told Klaus that he could provide stockfish of a grade Klaus had never seen before. Fish cured so perfectly that it would rehydrate into something close to fresh. Fish that could be sold to the Vatican, to wealthy merchants, to discriminating customers who would pay extraordinary prices. But Thorolf had conditions. He wanted payment in silver, not just credit. He wanted iron nails, high-quality rope, canvas for sails. He wanted tools, and he wanted the relationship kept secret. Klaus was intrigued but skeptical. Every fisherman claimed his product was the best. Why should he believe Thorvald's? So Thorvald brought samples. Not just one or two fish. He brought a dozen, all from the previous season, each one wrapped in oiled cloth. They unwrapped them in Klaus's office in the back of the tenement. Even dried. The quality was obvious. The fish were uniform in size. The color was a consistent gold. The flesh was firm with no soft spots. Klaus had been trading stockfish for 15 years, and he had rarely seen product this good. The next test was rehydration. Klaus took the samples and gave them to his cook. 3 days later, they ate the results. It was remarkable. The flesh flaked perfectly. The taste was clean, slightly sweet. There was none of the rancid or bitter aftertaste that plagued inferior stockfish. Klaus understood immediately that Thorolf was offering him a way to move up market. If he could secure a reliable supply of this quality, he could start selling to the top-tier buyers who were currently getting their fish from the best Danish and Icelandic producers. He could charge more. He could expand. He could stop competing on volume and start competing on quality. They struck a deal in the winter of 1623. It was handled quietly. Torolf did not unload his fish at the main docks where everyone could see. He brought his boat around to a smaller wharf at night. Claus's workers moved the cargo into the warehouse after dark. The payment was made in goods that Torvald could use to expand his operation. Iron nails, which were expensive and hard to get, let him build larger and better racks. Canvas let him repair his sails and boats without going into debt. The silver, a small amount, gave him liquidity. He could buy things immediately without credit. This was freedom. The arrangement continued year after year. Torolf kept delivering premium fish. Claus kept paying premium prices. Both men prospered. But they prospered quietly. This was crucial. In the small world of the Norwegian coast, where everyone knew everyone and gossip traveled faster than boats, secrecy was survival. If other fishermen found out that Torvald was getting better terms, they would demand the same. If the other German firms found out, they would pressure Claus to conform to standard rates. If the Bergen authorities found out, they might try to interfere or tax the arrangement. So both men kept their mouths shut. This is how empires start. Not with grand announcements, not with armies and flags, but with quiet deals in back rooms, with handshakes in the dark, with ledgers that show one thing, while the reality is something else. The Vogger families were building something that would eventually control 60% of the stockfish trade in Northern Europe. But in 1623, it was just Torolf and Klaus, and a few dozen fish changing hands in the shadows. Money is strange. A pile of silver sitting in a chest does nothing. It just sits there, getting older. But money in motion multiplies. It grows. It creates more money. This is what the Vogel families understood earlier than their competitors. They did not hoard their profits. They reinvested them immediately into the thing economists call capital, the equipment, infrastructure, and knowledge that let you produce more efficiently. Start with boats. In the early 1600s, most fishermen did not own their boats. They rented them from landlords or wealthy men in the villages. This rent was paid in fish, typically a third of the catch. So before you had fed your family or paid for supplies, a third of your work had gone to someone who had done nothing except own a boat. It was extraction, pure and simple. But boats were expensive. A good fishing boat, the traditional Nordland boat that was clinker, built with overlapping planks and could handle the brutal seas around Lofoten, cost as much as a man might earn in several years. No ordinary fisherman could afford one. The silver and credit that Torolf got from Claus changed this equation. In 1624, he bought his first boat, not from a landlord, but commissioned from a builder. He specified exactly what he wanted: length, width, depth, the type of wood, the quality of the fittings. He paid half up front in silver and half on delivery in stockfish. The builder was happy with these terms because silver was rare and stockfish was as good as cash. Owning a boat changed everything. Now, when Torolf's crew went fishing, they kept the entire catch. The profit margins tripled immediately. But Torolf did not stop at one boat. Over the next 5 years, he bought 3 more. Then he started letting his brothers and cousins use them in exchange for a smaller percentage than the landlords had charged. It was still rent extraction, but it kept the money in the family. The wealth circulated within the clan instead of leaking out to outsiders. Boats were just the beginning. The real competitive advantage was the H-gel racks. Building a great rack system required land, materials, and labor. The best drying locations were headlands and beaches where the wind was constant and strong. These spots were controlled by local landowners who charged fees for their use. The Vogel family started buying this land outright. Not renting, buying. They paid in stockfish and silver, offering deals that the landowners could not refuse. Why charge someone a fee every year when you could sell the land once for a large sum? Once they owned the land, they built permanent rack systems. These were not temporary structures that you put up and took down every season. These were engineered installations designed to last for generations. They used the best timber, properly treated to resist rot. They dug deep foundations for the poles. They calculated the load-bearing capacity so the racks would not collapse under the weight of thousands of fish. They oriented the structures to maximize wind exposure based on detailed observations of wind patterns throughout the season. The scale of these operations was unprecedented. By 1630, the Vogel families had racks that could dry 100,000 fish simultaneously. This sounds like a large number, but put it in context. The entire Lofoten fishery might catch several million skrei in a season. Most of those fish were processed by hundreds of small operators, each handling a few thousand. The Vogel operation was not the largest in absolute terms, but it was the most efficient. Their rejection rate for quality issues was higher than anyone else's. They threw away more fish than some operators sold, but what they kept and dried commanded prices that no one else could match. They also invested in knowledge. This might sound abstract, but it was as real as a boat or a rack. They experimented constantly with drying techniques. They tested different cutting methods. They tried varying the spacing between fish. They tracked weather conditions obsessively and correlated them with the quality of the final product. They discovered, for example, that fish dried during periods of stable high pressure turned out better than fish dried during variable weather, even if the temperature and wind were similar. Something about the atmospheric stability affected the process in ways that were not obvious, but were measurable in the quality of the product. This knowledge was not written down. It could not be. Most of the fishermen were illiterate. The knowledge lived in the hands and eyes of the people doing the work. You learn by watching and doing. A young man would spend years working under an experienced master, absorbing the subtle judgments. When do you pull a fish off the rack? Not based on a calendar, but based on how it looks, how it feels, even how it sounds when you tap it. These judgments could not be taught from a book. They had to be transmitted person to person. And the Vogel families guarded this transmission carefully. You only learned if you were family or married into it. Outsiders were not trained. This turned their expertise into a moat that competitors could not cross. Money kept flowing back from Klaus in Bergen, and money kept flowing out to build the machine. But it was not a closed loop. There was surplus. Profit beyond what could be immediately reinvested into fishing infrastructure. This surplus went into diversification. The families bought property in nearby towns. They bought shares in trading vessels that sailed to other parts of Europe. They started lending money to other fishermen at interest, becoming creditors themselves, a reversal of the traditional dynamic where fishermen were always in debt. By 1635, Torolv was no longer a fisherman. He still lived in the north. He still supervised the operation. But he did not go out in the boats. He managed. He negotiated. He made strategic decisions. His sons and nephews did the physical work. This was a sign of how much had changed. A generation earlier, every able-bodied man in a fishing family was out on the water. There was no surplus for management roles, but surplus, carefully invested, bought time. Time to think, time to plan, time to build something bigger. The wealth was not obvious from the outside. The family still lived in modest houses. They still wore rough wool clothes, at least when they were in the north. They did not build mansions or dress in silk. This was strategic. Ostentation would have attracted attention and envy. Other fishermen would have resented them. Authorities might have investigated them. The German merchants might have realized how much profit the Vogler families were actually making and tried to renegotiate terms. So they practiced what might be called stealth wealth. They looked poor. They complained about hard times like everyone else. But behind the facade, the money was accumulating. Klaus in Bergen was following a similar strategy. His firm grew, but not conspicuously. He did not try to take over the market. He stayed focused on the high end. He cultivated relationships with buyers who valued quality over price. He sold to monasteries, to wealthy merchant families, to the Hanseatic offices in other cities. He charged premium prices, and his customers paid them gladly because the product was consistently excellent. The relationship between Klaus and the Vogler families deepened into something more than a business arrangement. It became a partnership built on mutual benefit and, surprisingly, trust. Trust is rare in commerce, especially in an era when contracts were hard to enforce and legal systems were corrupt or indifferent. But both sides had too much to lose by cheating. If Klaus tried to cheat Torvald by paying too little, Torvald would take his fish elsewhere and Klaus would lose his source of premium product. If Torvald tried to cheat Klaus by delivering inferior fish, Klaus would end the relationship and Torvald would lose his best buyer. This mutual dependence created stability. They even began to share information. Klaus would write letters telling Torvald about market conditions in Germany, which cities were buying more, which were buying less. Rumors of war, which always increased demand for preserved food, prices that other producers were getting. This intelligence was invaluable. It let Torolf time his shipments to maximize profit. If demand was temporarily low, he would hold back stock and wait. If demand spiked, he would ship everything he had. Most fishermen had no access to this kind of market information. They sold when they needed money, regardless of whether prices were good. This information asymmetry was another layer of competitive advantage. The system was working. The machine was running. The Vogler families were no longer just surviving the Arctic winter. They were mastering it, monetizing it, turning the brutal climate into their greatest asset. But success creates its own problems. As the operation grew, it required more labor. More people had to know the techniques. More people had access to the trade relationships. More people understood how much money was actually being made. And more people meant more risk that the secret would leak. By 1645, the Vogler families had become what some people whispered about in taverns and smokehouses, the Stockfish barons. It was not an official title. You would not find it in any records. But everyone in the fishing communities knew who they meant. The families had risen so far above their origins that they existed in a different economic class. They owned most of the best drawing land on the outer islands. They operated a fleet of 8 boats. They employed dozens of men. They had established relationships with not just Klaus, but with several other German firms in Bergen, playing them against each other to get the best terms. The wealth had started to show. Torolf built a new house in the town of Svolvær, the administrative center of Lofoten. It was not a mansion, but it was substantial. 2 stories, real glass windows, a separate kitchen building, a barn for animals, a dock for his boats. This was prosperity that could not be hidden. Other fishermen saw it. They asked questions. How did Torolf afford such things? How was he getting the money? The cover story was that he had been lucky, that he had good fishing years, that he was frugal. But luck and frugality do not build glass windows. The sons of Torolv were now running most of the operation. Einar, the eldest, had inherited his father's caution and discipline. He was obsessive about quality control. He personally inspected the racks every day during drying season. He rejected fish that Torolv himself might have accepted. He pushed the family to maintain the standards that had built their reputation. He understood that their premium pricing depended entirely on consistent quality. One bad batch of fish that reached a customer in Lübeck or Venice could destroy years of reputation building. The second son, Halvar, was different. He was ambitious in a flashier way. He wanted to expand. He wanted to take over more of the market. He wanted to move beyond just supplying the Germans and start selling directly to customers in Europe. He had vision, but his vision sometimes outpaced his judgment. He pushed to buy more boats, build more racks, hire more men, even when Einar argued they were growing too fast. The third son, Arnfinn, was the negotiator. He handled the Bergen relationships. He had learned to speak German fluently, which was rare for a Norwegian fisherman. He made trips to Bergen several times a year, not just to deliver fish, but to schmooze with the merchants, to gather intelligence, to cultivate connections. He was the face of the family to the outside world. Charming, diplomatic, but underneath the charm was a calculating mind that was always looking for advantage. The three brothers worked together, mostly, but the differences in their temperaments were starting to create friction. Einar wanted to consolidate, to perfect what they had. Halvar wanted to grow aggressively. Arnfinn wanted to diversify, to get into other trades beyond stockfish. These tensions were manageable as long as Torolv was alive and active. He was the patriarch. His word was final. But Torolv was getting old. He was in his 60s, which was ancient for that time and place. His health was declining. His hands shook. His memory was not what it had been. Everyone knew that when he died, the question of who would lead would have to be answered. In 1647, Torolv died. It was winter. He had been out inspecting the racks despite the cold. He came back to the house complaining of chest pains. He sat down by the fire and never got up. They buried him in the churchyard at Kabelvåg, under a stone that listed his name and the years of his life and nothing else. No mention of his accomplishments. No mention of the empire he had built. In death, as in life, he kept his secrets. The inheritance was divided according to his will. The boats went to the three sons equally. The land and the drying racks were split, with Einar getting the largest share because he was the eldest. The silver and the credit relationships with the Bergen merchants were divided equally. It seemed fair on paper, but dividing a business three ways rarely works. The operation had succeeded because it was integrated. The boats, the racks, the relationships, the knowledge, they worked together as a system. Breaking them apart weakened all of it. The brothers tried to maintain unity. They agreed to coordinate their fishing and drying. They agreed to sell collectively through Arnfinn's contacts in Bergen. They agreed to maintain quality standards. But agreements on paper are fragile things. They depend on trust and goodwill. And those commodities were about to be tested. The crisis started with a bad season. The winter of 1649 was one of the worst on record. The squay came late and in smaller numbers. The weather was terrible, with storms that kept the boats in harbor for days at a time. When they finally could fish, the catches were meager. By March, when the season should have been winding down, the brothers had less than a quarter of their normal haul. This was a disaster. They had expenses. They had workers to pay. They had commitments to customers. And they had very little product. Einar wanted to maintain standards even in scarcity. He argued that they should sell what little they had at very high prices, explaining to customers that quality remained perfect, but supply was limited. Customers who valued the brand would pay. Halvar disagreed. He wanted to lower standards temporarily, to accept fish that were slightly smaller or slightly less perfect, so they could fill orders and maintain market share. If they failed to deliver, customers would find other suppliers and might not come back. Arnfinn was caught between them. He saw merit in both arguments. They compromised, which meant they did a little of both and satisfied no one. Some customers got premium fish at premium prices. Others got slightly inferior fish but were charged the same rates. And some customers got nothing because the brothers ran out of inventory. The result was predictable. Some customers were happy. Some were confused. Some were angry. The carefully cultivated reputation for consistency took a hit. The financial pressure created new tensions. Halvar, who had always wanted to expand, had borrowed money to build additional drying racks and buy another boat. He had assumed the income would keep flowing at high levels. Now he was overextended. He needed cash. He started pressing Einar and Arnfinn to liquidate some of the family assets. Sell land. Sell a boat. Get silver so he could pay his debts. Einar refused. Selling assets now, when they were vulnerable, would be stupid. They needed to weather the storm and wait for a good season to rebuild. Arnfinn sided with Einar. Halvar was outvoted. So Halvar did something that violated the unspoken rules of the family. He went around his brothers. He contacted a different German merchant in Bergen, not one of the family's usual partners, and offered to sell fish to him at a discount. He needed cash immediately, and this merchant was willing to pay in silver rather than credit. The fish Halvar sold came from his share of the racks, so technically it was his to sell. But by breaking the collective bargaining arrangement, he undercut the prices. Arnfinn was negotiating for the family. The German merchants, seeing division in the ranks, started playing the brothers against each other. Why pay premium prices to Arnfinn when Halvar would sell for less? Einar was furious when he found out. There was a confrontation. Witnesses later said they could hear the shouting from outside the house. Einar accused Halvar of betraying the family. Halvar said he was doing what he had to do to survive. And if Einar had managed the business better, they would not be in this situation. Arnfinn tried to mediate, but both brothers turned on him, accusing him of playing favorites. The unity that Torvald had maintained through force of personality and paternal authority was fracturing. The problem with family businesses is that business disputes become personal, and personal disputes become business problems. The brothers stopped speaking to each other, except when absolutely necessary. They started managing their operations separately. This meant duplication of effort, loss of efficiency, and, worst of all, loss of the knowledge sharing that had been crucial to their success. Einar had always been the master of drying techniques. Halvar's operation suffered because he no longer had access to Einar's expertise. Halvar had been the most aggressive fisherman, the one who took risks to fish in bad weather and often brought in bigger catches. Einar's operation suffered because his crews were more cautious. Arnfinn had the best relationships in Bergen, but now Einar and Halvar were both trying to sell directly, and they were competing with each other, driving down prices. The German merchants were delighted. This was a gift. For decades they had been paying premium prices to the Vogar families because the families had maintained a united front. Now that front had collapsed. The merchants could negotiate with each brother separately, playing them off against one another. They could demand lower prices, better terms, exclusivity agreements. They could claw back all the concessions they had made over the years. The balance of power shifted back toward Bergen. Other fishing families noticed what was happening. The Vogger Empire, which had seemed invincible, was bleeding. This created opportunity. Competitors started trying to poach the Vogger workers, offering them better pay to come teach them the drying techniques. Some workers stayed loyal, others did not. Loyalty is expensive when you have children to feed. The secrets that the Vogger families had guarded so carefully began to leak. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic revelation, but in a slow seepage. A worker here mentions a particular detail about the knot used to tie fish. A worker there describes the spacing between rack poles. Another talks about the weather conditions that produce the best results. Piece by piece, the knowledge spread. By 1652, several other families were producing stockfish that was nearly as good as the Vogger product. Not quite. The Vogger family still had advantages in terms of the best land, the best equipment, decades of accumulated experience. But the gap had narrowed. And in a commodity market, a small quality difference does not justify a large price difference. The premium pricing that had funded the empire started to erode. Alvar became desperate. His debts were crushing him. He made a decision that would later be seen as the final betrayal. He sold one of the family drying locations to an outsider. Not another fisherman, but a merchant from Bergen who wanted to get into the stockfish production business. Einar found out when workers showed up with a deed claiming ownership. He was apoplectic. That land had been bought with money that Thorwald had earned. It was family patrimony. Halvar had no right to sell it without consulting everyone. Halvar's defense was that it was part of his inheritance and he could do what he wanted with it. Technically true, morally indefensible. This was the breaking point. Einar declared that he was severing all ties with Halvar. They would no longer cooperate in any way. Arnfinn was forced to choose sides. He chose Einar, partly because he agreed with him, partly because Einar controlled more assets. Halvar found himself isolated, 2 against 1. His brothers cut him out of the Bergen relationships. They stopped sharing information. They refused to help him when his fishing boats needed repairs. It was business warfare waged between siblings. Halvar fought back the only way he could. He started spreading rumors. He told people in Bergen that Einar's operation was cutting corners, that the quality of the fish was declining. He told competitors in Lofoten about techniques that the family had kept secret. He became a saboteur. If he could not win, he would make sure his brothers paid a price for excluding him. This scorched earth strategy hurt everyone. The Vogger brand, which had been built on trust and consistency, was now associated with family feuds and unreliability. Customers started looking elsewhere. The Germans in Bergen, always opportunistic, began sourcing fish from other suppliers. The flow of silver and high-quality goods that had sustained the empire slowed to a trickle. The children and grandchildren of Thorwald watched as everything he had built came apart. The boats were sold off one by one to pay debts. The drying racks, those magnificent structures that had been the cathedrals of commerce, fell into disrepair. Without the constant maintenance they required, the wood rotted. The poles collapsed. By 1660, most of them were gone, torn down for scrap or simply left to decompose. The families themselves fragmented. Some moved away to Bergen or Trondheim, trying to establish themselves as merchants in those southern cities. Some stayed in Lofoten, returning to ordinary fishing, accepting employment from the new operators who had taken over the drying grounds. The grandchildren barely remembered the glory days. They grew up hearing stories about how their great-grandfather had been rich, but the evidence was hard to see. The wealth had evaporated like moisture from a hanging cod. The collapse of the Vogler dynasty did not mean the end of the stockfish trade. Far from it. The industry was bigger than ever by the middle of the 17th century, but it had fundamentally changed. The techniques that the Vogler families had pioneered and protected were now common knowledge. Any fisherman with access to good drying land and decent equipment could produce acceptable stockfish. The market had democratized. This was good for fishermen in general. Prices were fairer. The Germans in Bergen had less power to squeeze producers because there were so many alternatives. Competition increased. Innovation continued. But something was lost. The peak quality that the Vogler families had achieved at their height became rare again. When production was concentrated in the hands of a few obsessive families who had the capital and expertise to be selective, you got extraordinary product. When production was dispersed among hundreds of small operators who were just trying to survive, quality became inconsistent. The market adjusted. Premium pricing disappeared. Stockfish became a commodity rather than a luxury good. It was sold by weight, not by reputation. A merchant in Hamburg buying stockfish in 1670 had no idea who had produced it. He just knew it came from Norway. It was standardized, interchangeable, boring. This commodification had consequences that rippled through the economy. The Hanseatic merchants in Bergen lost interest in maintaining such tight control over the trade. There was less profit in it. The margins were thinner. Some of the German firms closed their offices and went home. Others shifted focus to different products. The Bergen Wharf, which had been the pulsing heart of the stockfish trade for centuries, began a long, slow decline. The building still stood. Trade still happened. But the energy was gone. The sense that this was where fortunes were made had faded. The Norwegian crown tried to step in and regulate the trade. Seeing an opportunity to extract taxes and fees that had previously gone to the Germans, they established rules about quality standards, inspection procedures, export licensing. Bureaucrats who had never gutted a fish in their lives wrote regulations about how fish should be processed. Predictably, the regulations were ignored or worked around. Fishermen bribed inspectors. Merchants falsified paperwork. The crown got some revenue, but not as much as they hoped. Trying to tax a decentralized industry of stubborn, independent operators was like trying to catch smoke. What happened to the people? The individuals who had risen so high and fallen so far? Einar, the eldest son who had tried to maintain standards, died in 1668. He was 63, which was old for that time. He died in the same house where his father had died, but the house was mortgaged. His children sold it after his death to pay off debts. He was buried next to Thorvald in the Kabelwald churchyard, under a similar plain stone. His legacy was complicated. He had been right about many things. His insistence on quality had been correct. But his rigidity had also contributed to the family fracture. He had been unable to bend or compromise, and in the end, that inflexibility had broken him. Halvar, the ambitious second son, had a darker trajectory. His betrayals had made him wealthy for a brief period. The merchant from Bergen who had bought the drying land from him made Halvar a partner in a new venture. They tried to compete with the remaining Vogler operations by undercutting on price while maintaining decent quality. It worked for a few years. Halvar moved to Bergen permanently. He bought a house, not on Bryggen with the Germans, but in the Norwegian part of town. He tried to establish himself as a respectable merchant, but his reputation followed him. People knew he had betrayed his family. In the tight social circles of Bergen, where reputation was everything, he was always an outsider. Business deals fell through. Partnerships dissolved. By the time he died in 1671, he was back in debt. His children inherited nothing but his bad name. Arnfinn, the negotiator, was the only one who managed to preserve some of the family fortune. He had always been the most adaptable. When the stockfish business started declining, he diversified. He used his contacts in Bergen to get into other trades. Timber, copper from the mines inland. He was never as rich as his father had been at the peak, but he was comfortable. His children grew up in Trondheim, where he eventually moved. They became merchants and minor officials. They married into other merchant families. Within 2 generations, the connection to Lofoten and fishing had been almost completely severed. The great-grandchildren of Thorolf were city people. They wore fine clothes and spoke refined Norwegian with no trace of the northern dialect. They owned shares in trading companies but had never been in a fishing boat. The transformation was complete. This is what success looks like across generations. It erases its own origins. The descendants of the stockfish barons did become wealthy families in Bergen and Trondheim, just as the story arc promised. But they did not stay wealthy because of stockfish. They stayed wealthy because Arnfinn had been smart enough to take the capital accumulated from stockfish and move it into other sectors before the industry declined. The fish had been a ladder. Once you climbed it, you kicked it away. You did not tell your grandchildren about the freezing robur and the bloody hands and the stink of fish guts. You told them about international trade and business acumen and family heritage. You rewrote the story to make it respectable. The irony is that the Lofoten fishery continued to thrive. The skrei kept coming every winter in their millions. Fishermen kept catching them. The racks kept being built and rebuilt. The stockfish kept being produced and exported. By 1700, Norway was exporting more stockfish than ever before in history. The industry the Våger families had helped revolutionize was bigger and more successful than when they controlled it. But the wealth was distributed differently. Instead of a few families capturing most of the profit, thousands of families made modest livings. This was probably more just, more democratic, better for society overall. But it meant that no one else ever rose the way the stockfish barons had risen. The conditions that had allowed that concentration of wealth and power had been unique to a specific moment in time. Understanding how the Våger families achieved what they achieved requires understanding the mechanics of monopoly. Not in the legal sense of government granted exclusive rights, but in the practical sense of controlling something valuable that others cannot easily replicate. The Våger families never had a legal monopoly. Anyone could dry fish. Anyone could sell to Bergen. But they had something better. They had a natural monopoly based on expertise, infrastructure, and relationships. Start with geography. Not all coastline is equally good for drying fish. You need consistent wind, cold temperatures that stay below freezing but not too far below, protection from excessive humidity, and access to the fishing grounds. The outer islands of Lofoten had these conditions in abundance. But even within Lofoten, some locations were better than others. The Våger families had identified and acquired the premium spots. The headlands where wind funneled through gaps in the mountains. The beaches with optimal orientation to the sun. Once they owned this land, competitors could not access it. They had to make do with inferior locations where the drying was slower or less consistent. This geographic advantage was the foundation. Next, infrastructure. Building great HL racks required capital, skill, and time. You could not just pound some poles into the ground and call it done. The soil analysis to find bedrock for stable foundations. The engineering to calculate load-bearing capacity. The joinery to create connections that would not fail during storms. The Våger families had spent decades perfecting their racks. A competitor starting from scratch would need years and significant investment to match them. Most fishermen did not have that kind of capital or patience. They used smaller, simpler racks that worked adequately, but not optimally. This infrastructure advantage compounded over time. Then there was knowledge. The specific techniques for selecting fish, cutting them, tying them, spacing them, monitoring them, knowing when to pull them down. This was craft knowledge, embodied in people rather than written in books. The Vogel families had developed this expertise through systematic experimentation and observation. They had made mistakes and learned from them. They had refined their methods over generations. A competitor might learn some of these techniques by observation or by hiring away workers. But getting all of it, the complete integrated system, was much harder. This knowledge advantage was what allowed them to maintain superior quality even when others had similar equipment. The relationship network was perhaps the most valuable asset. Claus and his successors in Bergen were not just buyers. They were partners who provided market intelligence, credit, and access to high-end customers. These relationships had been built over years through consistent performance and personal trust. A new fisherman showing up in Bergen with his first load of premium stockfish would not get the same terms. He had no track record. He had no reputation. He would be treated like every other unknown supplier, offered low prices on credit terms that kept him in debt. Breaking into the top tier of the market required someone on the inside vouching for you, and the Vogel families controlled those vouchers. Finally, there was capital itself. Money accumulated from successful seasons gave the Vogel families the ability to weather bad seasons. When fish were scarce and prices dropped, they did not have to sell immediately to survive. They could hold inventory and wait for prices to recover. They could maintain quality standards even when that meant lower volume. Most fishermen did not have this luxury. They lived season to season. A bad year meant genuine hardship. They had to sell whatever they caught at whatever price was offered. This desperation was what kept most fishermen poor. The Vogel families had escaped that desperation trap. Having capital meant having choices. Having choices meant having power. These 5 elements together created a competitive moat that was extremely difficult to cross. You could not just copy one element. You needed all of them working together. This is why monopolies, even informal ones, are so stable. The advantages reinforce each other. Success funds more success. The gap between leaders and followers widens over time, rather than narrowing. But monopolies also contain the seeds of their own destruction. The very factors that make them strong also make them vulnerable. Geographic concentration means that a single bad season or natural disaster affects you disproportionately. Infrastructure requires maintenance that becomes harder to afford if revenue drops. Knowledge concentrated in a few people can be lost if those people die or leave or fight. Relationships depend on specific individuals and break down when those individuals have conflicts. Capital can be squandered through bad decisions or stolen through embezzlement or lost to debt. The Vogel dynasty collapsed because all of these failure modes hit simultaneously. The bad fishing season created financial stress. The death of Torov removed the person who held the knowledge and relationships together. The infighting between his sons fractured the unified operation. The capital was wasted on feuds and bad investments. The lesson here is that monopolies are temporary. They exist during windows of opportunity when the conditions align. But conditions always change. Markets evolve. Knowledge spreads. Competitors adapt. What worked brilliantly in 1630 did not work in 1660. The Vogel families were not stupid or lazy. They did not suddenly forget how to dry fish. They lost their monopoly because the structural conditions that had sustained it changed. The industry matured. Techniques diffused. Capital became more available as the overall economy grew. The barriers to entry lowered. This pattern repeats throughout economic history. A pioneer identifies an opportunity and exploits it brilliantly, building a dominant position. Imitators observe and copy. The pioneer tries to defend their position through secrecy, exclusive contracts, or control of key resources. Sometimes this works for a generation or two, but eventually the barriers break down. The advantage erodes. The extraordinary profits disappear. The industry transitions from being dominated by a few large players to being populated by many small players. This transition is usually good for consumers and for society, even though it is painful for the former monopolists. The stockfish trade in the late 17th century became more competitive, more efficient, and more fair, but it also became less dramatic. There were no more rags to riches stories, no more dynasties being built, just ordinary people doing ordinary work and making ordinary livings. This is what mature markets look like. They are boring. Stability and fairness are boring. We tell stories about the monopoly phase because that is where the drama is. That is where fortunes are won and lost, where innovations happen, where individuals matter. Once the industry matures, individual actors become less important. The system runs itself according to its own logic, grinding away year after year, producing value but no longer producing legends. The lens through which we have been viewing this story is Arctic economic alchemy, the transformation of worthless into gold, frozen fish into trade monopoly, geographic curse into competitive advantage. This framing has been useful for understanding the rise of the stockfish barons. But now we must apply the same lens to understand their fall, because alchemy is reversible. Gold can turn back into lead. Advantage can become liability. Mastery can become imprisonment. The coal that had been their greatest asset became their limitation. The drying technique only worked in a specific climate. This meant the Vogler families were geographically fixed. They could not move their operation to be closer to markets. They could not diversify into warmer waters where other fish species were abundant. They were locked into Lofoten by the very mechanism that had made them successful. When the local fish populations fluctuated, they had no alternatives. When local political situations changed and taxes increased, they could not relocate. Geographic advantage is also geographic imprisonment. The expertise that had given them superior quality became a burden. Maintaining those exacting standards required constant attention and discipline. It was exhausting. It created pressure. When times were good and prices were high, the effort felt worth it. But when times were bad and prices dropped, maintaining peak quality meant accepting lower profits and competitors who cut corners. The perfection that had built their reputation became unsustainable in a more competitive market. They were caught in a trap of their own making. If they lowered standards, they lost the premium pricing that justified the operation. If they maintained standards, they could not compete on cost with less demanding producers. The secrecy that had protected their monopoly poisoned their family relations. Keeping knowledge within the bloodline meant teaching sons but not daughters, teaching direct heirs but not cousins who married into other families. This created resentment. It created a sense that some family members were insiders and others were outsiders. When the time came to make hard decisions about the future of the business, these divisions became battle lines. The choice to prioritize family loyalty over business competence, to keep things secret rather than bring in outside management or partners, ultimately weakened the operation. The relationships with the German merchants that had been so profitable were also relationships of dependence. The Vogel families had put most of their eggs in the Bergen basket. When those relationships soured or when the Germans themselves faced problems, The Vogar families had few alternatives. They had not cultivated a diverse customer base. They had not developed the capability to sell directly to end users. They were dependent on intermediaries, and dependent people are vulnerable people. The very partnerships that had lifted them up also exposed them to risks they could not control. The capital that had bought them freedom also made them conservative. Once you have something to lose, you become risk-averse. The early Vogel families had been bold. They had taken chances. They had experimented. But success made them cautious. They started protecting what they had rather than seeking new opportunities. When Havre proposed expansion into new markets or new products, Einar resisted because it threatened the existing operation. This conservatism, this focus on defending the castle rather than exploring new territories, made them vulnerable to competitors who had nothing to lose and were willing to try anything. Alchemy, remember, was always a metaphor. Medieval alchemists believed they could transform base metals into gold through some combination of chemistry and magic. They failed because transmutation is not actually possible through chemical means. The atoms are different, but economic alchemy is real. You can transform raw materials into valuable products through knowledge and labor. The Vogel families prove this. They took fish that would have rotted and made them into commodities that fed millions. They turned the Arctic wind into a tool that worked for them. This was genuine transformation, genuine value creation. But the reverse is also true. Value can be destroyed as easily as it is created. A business built over decades can collapse in years. A reputation earned through consistent quality can be lost through a few instances of failure. Capital accumulated through careful savings can be squandered through reckless spending or bad luck. The wind that preserves can also destroy. A storm can wreck a fleet. A warm winter can ruin a drying season. The environment that gives can also take away. You never own it. You just borrow it for a while. The Stockfish barons learned this lesson in the hardest way possible. They had thought they had mastered the Arctic. They had thought they had built something permanent. They had transformed themselves from poor fishermen into wealthy merchants, from nobodies into somebodies. The transformation had felt like magic because it was so complete. But it was not permanent. Nothing is. The conditions that allowed the transformation were temporary. When those conditions changed, the transformation reversed. Gold turned back into lead. Wealthy merchants turned back into struggling fishermen. The sons and grandsons of barons became ordinary men. This is not a tragedy in the sense of being avoidable. It was not the result of moral failure or stupidity. It was the inevitable result of time and change. The tragedy, if there is one, is in the forgetting. Within a few generations, no one remembered exactly how it had been done. The specific techniques, the exact arrangements, the relationships and knowledge that had made it all work were lost. The descendants knew that their ancestors had been important somehow, had been wealthy somehow, but the details were hazy. The family stories turned into legends, turned into vague myths about the good old days when fish made fortunes. Historians looking back can piece together fragments of the story from trade records, from church archives, from the physical remains of the great drying racks that occasionally turn up during coastal construction projects. But the lived experience, the day-to-day reality of what it meant to be a Stockfish baron at the height of their power, is gone. We can reconstruct the economics. We can map the trade networks. We can analyze the preservation techniques. But we cannot fully recover what it felt like to stand on those frozen rocks in January, looking at the racks heavy with thousands of fish, and knowing that each one represented wealth, that the wind was working for you, that you had solved the puzzle that kept everyone else poor. By 1700, The memory of the vulgar dominance had faded into background. New families had risen in the stockfish trade. Some became quite successful, though none ever matched the peak of the stockfish barons. The industry had stabilized into a pattern that would last for centuries. Fishermen caught cod during the winter. They dried it on racks along the coast. Merchants bought it and shipped it to Europe. Everyone made a living. No one made a killing. This was the mature equilibrium of a competitive market. But the infrastructure that the vulgar families had built, the physical plant of their empire, left echoes that lasted much longer than their wealth. The drying racks they had constructed became templates that others copied. The specific design innovations, the spacing between poles, the height of the crossbeams, the orientation to the wind, all of this became standard practice. Fishermen throughout Lofoten built racks that looked remarkably similar to the vulgar originals, often without knowing where the design had come from. It had just become the way things were done. This is how knowledge propagates. It starts as a trade secret, then it leaks, then it becomes common practice. Finally, it becomes traditional wisdom that everyone knows but no one remembers learning. The towns where the vulgar families had operated prospered in the 18th and 19th centuries. Svolvær grew from a small fishing village into the commercial center of Lofoten. The harbor where Thorns had docked his first boats expanded into a major port. Warehouses were built to store fish. Processing facilities were established to prepare fish for export. By the 1800s, Svolvær had a permanent population of merchants, craftsmen, and officials serving the fishing industry. The town's prosperity was built on foundations laid by the stockfish barons generations earlier. They had proven that commercial operations could be based there year-round. They had established the trade routes and market relationships. Later entrepreneurs were walking paths that had been blazed decades before. The German presence in Bergen gradually declined, but never disappeared completely. The Hanseatic contour officially closed in 1754, ending nearly 500 years of German dominance of Norwegian trade. But German merchants continued to operate in Bergen as private firms rather than as part of the organized league. The stockfish trade continued to flow through Bergen for another century, though its relative importance decreased as other industries grew. The old wooden buildings on Bergen, those counting houses where Claus and his successors had negotiated with the vulgar families, burned down repeatedly in the fires that plagued the crowded waterfront. They were rebuilt each time, always in the same style, until by the 20th century, they were preserved as historical monuments. Tourists walk through them now, taking photographs, not knowing that these picturesque structures were once the nodes in a network that fed millions of people and created fortunes that rose and fell like the tides. The technique of drying cod in the open air remained Norway's most important food preservation technology well into the modern era. Even after refrigeration and canning were invented, stockfish continued to be produced in massive quantities. It was cheap. It was reliable. It required no fuel or complex equipment. The Arctic wind was free and inexhaustible. Norwegian stockfish was exported to Africa, to the Caribbean, to South America. It became a staple food in places that had no historical connection to Scandinavia. In Nigeria, dried cod is still used in traditional soups. In Italy, bacalhau, dishes made from stockfish, are regional specialties. In Brazil, there are festivals celebrating cod, even though cod do not swim in Brazilian waters. All of this is the legacy of fishermen who figured out how to preserve protein using nothing but wind and time. The modern Lofoten fishery is still active. The skrei still come every winter. Fishermen still catch them, though now with steel boats and sonar and motors, instead of oars and sails. Some fish is still dried on wooden racks, mostly for the traditional market and for tourists who want to see the old methods. But most production has moved to industrial facilities where climate is controlled and drying is mechanized. The process is faster and more consistent, but less dramatic. You do not see the cathedral-like racks covering the beaches anymore. The landscape has changed. The romance has faded. But the basic economic logic remains the same. Take something abundant and perishable and turn it into something scarce and permanent. Transform biological material into storable wealth. The Stockfish barons understood this 500 years ago. We are still doing it, just with different tools. The descendants of the Vogar families, those who stayed in Norway and did not emigrate to America or elsewhere, are scattered now throughout the country. Some are still in the fishing industry, working on trawlers or managing processing plants. Some went into other occupations completely, becoming teachers or engineers or bureaucrats. A few genealogists and local historians have traced the family lines, connecting modern individuals back to Thorolf and his sons. Occasionally, one of these descendants learns about their ancestry and feels a brief flash of pride or curiosity. But mostly, people go about their lives not thinking much about what their great-great-great-great-great-grandfather did for a living. This is the way with all empires, even small ones. They burn bright for a moment and then fade. The individuals who built them die. Their children remember them. Their grandchildren remember stories. Their great-grandchildren remember that there were stories, but not what they said. Eventually, the connection is lost completely. You become a name in a church register, a notation in a property transfer document, a ghost in the archives. But the thing they built, the system they created, continues without them. The industry they revolutionized keeps producing. The techniques they developed keep being used. The towns they founded keep growing. The trade routes they established keep carrying goods. This is the paradox of economic innovation. The individual innovator rarely captures more than a tiny fraction of the total value created. Most of it spills over to benefit others. Consumers get better products at lower prices. Competitors learn from the pioneer and improve on their methods. Society as a whole becomes richer. The Stockfish barons made a fortune, but the total value they created was orders of magnitude larger than what they personally captured. This is why historians remember them, even if their descendants do not. They were not just rich men. They were agents of transformation who helped build the economic infrastructure of a region. There is a pattern to how fortunes are made in pre-modern economies. It starts with a resource that everyone sees, but no one knows how to exploit. Then someone figures out the trick. They find the technique, the process, the method that unlocks value. For a brief period, they have a monopoly on this knowledge. They get rich. Then the knowledge spreads. Competition increases. Prices fall. Profits normalize. The fortune that was made in the first generation is spent or dissipated by the third generation. This cycle repeats across industries and centuries with remarkable consistency. The geometry of fortune, if you could draw it, would look like a sharp peak followed by a long decline. The peak is where the pioneers make their money. The decline is the long tail where the benefits spread to everyone else. The Vogel families were on the peak. They timed it perfectly, entering the stockfish trade just as the techniques were being perfected and the markets were expanding, and exiting just as competition eroded their advantages. They did not exit voluntarily, of course. They were forced out by their own mistakes and by larger economic forces. But the timing of their rise and fall fits the classic pattern. Why does this pattern exist? Why do monopolies rarely last more than a generation or two? The economic explanations are well known. Knowledge diffuse. Capital accumulates. Barriers to entry fall. But there is also a human dimension. The people who build empires are different from the people who inherit them. Thorolf was a fisherman who became a merchant through sheer will and cleverness. He knew poverty. He remembered hunger. This gave him a drive that his sons never quite had. They grew up with security. They took the infrastructure for granted. They did not have the same hunger, the same willingness to endure hardship, the same obsessive focus on quality and efficiency. This is not moral criticism. It is just observation. People are shaped by their circumstances. The circumstances of growing up wealthy are different from the circumstances of growing up poor. The skills and attitudes that let you build a fortune are not the same as the skills and attitudes that let you maintain one. The sons of Thorvalds were not incompetent. Einar, in particular, was skilled and dedicated. But they lacked the unity of purpose that their father had embodied. Thorolf could make decisions quickly because he was the only decision-maker. When he died, an authority was divided 3 ways. Every decision became a negotiation. Every difference of opinion became a potential conflict. The business became slower and more risk-averse because consensus is conservative. This is the curse of inheritance in family businesses. Division of assets means division of authority means paralysis. The Stockfish barons could have solved this problem by establishing clear succession rules or by incorporating as a joint stock company where ownership was separated from management. But these institutional innovations did not exist yet, at least not in that form, in that place, at that time. Family businesses were run by families. Authority flowed from blood relationships. This was the social technology available. It worked fine when the family got along. It failed catastrophically when they did not. Looking at the entire arc of the story, from Thorvalds as a poor fisherman in 1620 to the dispersal of his great-grandchildren into ordinary middle-class life, by 1700 we see a complete cycle. Beginning, middle, end, rise, peak, is fall. This satisfying narrative structure is partly an artifact of how we tell stories. We like neat arcs. Real life is messier, but the core pattern is real. The vulgar families did rise meteorically based on innovation and execution. They did dominate their market for a generation. They did collapse due to internal conflict and external competition. This happened. The details may be dramatized or simplified in the telling, but the skeleton of the story is historically accurate. The question that haunts any telling of this story is whether it had to end the way it did. Could the Stockfish barons have maintained their position? Could they have avoided the family feuds and the loss of market share? Could they have transitioned into something sustainable across generations? The answer is probably no. The forces working against them were too strong. The diffusion of knowledge was inevitable. The maturation of the market was inevitable. The family conflicts, while not inevitable in their specific form, were highly likely given the stresses they were under. They might have done things differently and extended their dominance for another generation, but eventually the same forces would have caught up with them. There is no permanent monopoly. There is no eternal fortune. Everything that rises must converge back to the mean. This is a melancholy conclusion, but it is also a democratic one. It means that no family, no matter how clever or hardworking, can permanently dominate an industry and extract rents forever. It means that innovation is rewarded but not indefinitely. It means that markets have a self-correcting tendency to spread benefits more widely over time. The Stockfish barons got rich. Good for them. They earned it through insight and effort. But their monopoly dissolved, allowing thousands of other fishermen to make decent livings. Good for them too. Both outcomes are just. The lens of Arctic economic alchemy gives us one final insight. Alchemy was always about transformation. The medieval alchemists wanted to transform lead into gold, but they also wanted to transform themselves. They sought spiritual enlightenment through their experiments. The process was as important as the product. The Stockfish barons underwent a transformation as complete as any alchemical operation. They transformed frozen fish into gold. Yes, but they also transformed themselves. From peasants into merchants. From subjects into actors. From people who accepted their fate into people who shaped their own destiny. This transformation, the human transformation, was the real alchemy. And when the gold turned back into lead, when the fortune dissipated and the family scattered, had the transformation been undone? Not entirely. The descendants of the Stockfish barons carried something forward that their ancestors had not had. Education, literacy, connections, cultural capital, the ability to imagine themselves as something other than fishermen. Some of them became merchants in Bergen and Trondheim, as we noted earlier. But even the ones who remained working class had a different relationship to their work. They knew that it was possible to rise. They had proof in their own family history. This knowledge, this possibility, is itself a kind of wealth that does not show up in account books, but matters tremendously for how people live their lives. The story of the Lofoten cod fishermen's hidden trade networks in 17th century Norway is ultimately a story about agency, about people who refuse to accept the limitations that geography and social position placed on them, about the discovery that the environment, properly understood, is not a constraint but a tool, about the building of systems that create wealth from nothing more than knowledge and persistence, about the fragility of those systems and the inevitability of their dissolution, about the ways that innovation enriches individuals, but also, eventually, enriches everyone, about transformation and its limits, about alchemy, economic and human, and what remains when the magic fades and you are left with reality. The Arctic winter at Lofoten is still an icy hell. The temperatures still drop to 30 below. The sea still freezes for months. The wind still howls. But it is no longer a place where people only suffer and survive. It is a place where people work and prosper. Not as spectacularly as the Stockfish barons at their peak, but steadily, reliably. The transformation they initiated became permanent, even though their personal fortune did not. They proved that the cold was not a curse. They proved that geography was not destiny. They proved that worthless could become priceless if you understood the mechanism. And that proof is that demonstration that transformation was possible, changed the North forever. The racks still stand on the beaches. The fish still hang drying in the wind. The wind still blows, indifferent and eternal, doing what it has always done. Except now we know how to work with it instead of merely against it. That knowledge is the real gold. That knowledge cannot be lost or stolen or dissipated. That knowledge, the gift of the Stockfish barons to the future, is what remains when everything else has blown away. Look closer at how money actually moved through this system. Not the abstract idea of trade, but the physical reality of it. When Thorolf sailed south to Bergen in the spring of 1625 with his first major shipment of premium stockfish, he was not carrying money. He was carrying weight. 3 tons of dried cod packed in his boat's hold. Each fish tied in bundles of 20. Each bundle wrapped in coarse canvas to protect it from moisture during the voyage. The smell alone was overpowering. That sharp, concentrated protein odor that marked stockfish. His crew complained about it for the entire 3-day journey down the coast. But that smell was the smell of wealth. Bergen's harbor was chaos when they arrived. Dozens of boats from up and down the coast, all converging at the same time, because spring was when the dried fish was ready and winter storms had passed. The Germans on Bergen were expecting this annual flood. They had their systems. boats queued in designated areas. Inspectors came aboard to assess the cargo before it was even unloaded. This is where most fishermen lost the negotiation before it began. The inspector would poke through the bundles, pull out random fish, examine them critically, and declare a grade. Second, quality. Third, quality. Sometimes refuse, meaning worthless. The grade determined the price, and the price was always lower than the fishermen hoped. But Thorolf had claws. When his boat arrived, it was directed to a different wharf. Klaus's own inspector came aboard, but this was theater. They both knew the quality was exceptional because they had established this relationship over previous smaller transactions. The inspection was cursory. The fish was graded first quality, premium category. This designation mattered enormously. It meant the fish would be packed for export to Italy and other high-value markets rather than being sold as bulk rations. Payment happened in Klaus's counting house. A dark wooden room lit by small windows and oil lamps even in daytime. There was a massive table scarred by decades of use. Account books lined the shelves. This is where the alchemy of trade happened. Klaus offered payment in mixed form. Some silver coins, actual physical money, cold and heavy in your palm. More importantly, credit notes that could be redeemed at the firm's warehouse. And most valuably, specific goods that Thorvald had requested, 30 kegs of iron nails, each nail hand forged in Germany, 20 fathoms of hempen rope, thick as a man's wrist, bolts of canvas for sail repair, a set of steel knives that would stay sharp through an entire fishing season, 3 barrels of rye flour, enough to feed his extended family through the summer. The economics were complex. Klaus was not being generous. He was making substantial profit on this transaction. The stockfish Thoralf delivered would sell in Venice for 3 times what Klaus paid for it, maybe 4 times. The goods Klaus provided had been bought in bulk at wholesale prices but were being transferred to Thoralf at something close to retail. The silver was the smallest component of the payment, barely enough to cover immediate cash needs. But even with these markups, Thorolf was getting a far better deal than he would from any other merchant. Klaus was taking a smaller margin in exchange for guaranteed supply of premium product. Both men were winning. This is what actual trade looks like. Not equal, but mutually beneficial. The physical goods Thorolf received were transformative. Those iron nails let him build stronger boats and bigger drying racks. The rope was essential for fishing and for rigging. The canvas meant he could maintain his boats without going into debt to local suppliers who charged extortionate prices. The flour was literal survival, the calories that would keep his family alive during months when fish were scarce. And the silver, that small amount of hard currency, gave him negotiating power in other transactions. Silver was universally accepted. If he needed to buy something immediately from someone who did not want to trade for fish, he could pay in coins. This liquidity was freedom. But here is what made the system truly revolutionary. Thorolf did not consume all these goods himself. He used them to expand his operation. The nails went into new drying racks. The rope was used on boats that his brothers operated, and they paid him back in labor during the drying season. The canvas was sold to other fishermen at a small markup, creating another revenue stream. Even the flour was partially traded to neighbors in exchange for help with construction projects. Every input was leveraged. Every resource was multiplied. This is how capital accumulation works at the ground level. You do not get rich by working hard and saving money. You get rich by taking resources and using them to generate more resources, which you then reinvest into generating even more resources. The cycle compounds. The cold itself, the Arctic wind that made the drying possible, was the ultimate form of free energy. It required no fuel. No machinery, no ongoing cost. The sun and wind did all the work. This is what made the economic model so powerful. The marginal cost of production was incredibly low once you had the infrastructure in place. Catching the fish required labor and boats, yes, but drying them required almost nothing except time and attention. A fisherman in southern Europe who wanted to preserve fish by salting had to buy salt continuously. Salt was expensive. It was a recurring cost that ate into profits. The Lofoten fishermen had discovered a preservation method with near zero variable costs. The climate was doing the work for free. This is why the margins were so high. This is why fortunes could be made. Think about the mathematics of it. A single scry cod, fresh caught, might weigh 10 pounds. After drying, it weighed 2 pounds. 80% of the weight was water that had been removed by the wind. That 2-pound dried fish could be transported much more easily than 10 pounds of fresh fish. It could be stored indefinitely without spoiling. And when rehydrated, it would swell back to perhaps 6 or 7 pounds of edible fish. The weight reduction meant that shipping costs were dramatically lower. A boat that could carry 3 tons of fresh fish could carry 15 tons of dried fish. This transportation efficiency was another form of economic alchemy. You were effectively transporting 5 times as much protein in the same space. The Germans in Bergen understood this arithmetic perfectly. This is why they wanted stockfish so badly. It was the ideal trade good. High value, low weight, long-lasting, easy to standardize and grade. They could ship it all over Europe and it would arrive in the same condition it left. Contrast this with salted herring, another major Norwegian export. Herring spoiled if the salt ratio was wrong. The barrels leaked. Quality varied wildly. Stockfish was reliable. This reliability is what let the trade grow so large. Merchants in distant cities could order Norwegian stockfish with confidence that it would arrive in usable condition months later. The network that the Våger families built with Klaus and other Bergen merchants was not just a business relationship. It became an information system, a communications network, an intelligence apparatus that gave them advantages far beyond the immediate trade in fish. This is what historians miss when they focus only on tonnage and prices. The real power was in the knowledge that flowed through the network. Klaus sent letters to Thorald. Not often, because paper was expensive and sending correspondence north was unreliable. But several times a year, a sealed letter would arrive, carried by a trusted ship captain. These letters contained market intelligence. Klaus would report on prices in different European cities. He would mention which regions were experiencing grain shortages or surpluses, which affected what those regions could afford to pay for fish. He would pass along rumors about wars, which always increased demand for preserved food to feed armies. He would warn about new competitors entering the market or about quality problems with fish from other regions. This information was gold. It let Thorolf make better decisions about when to sell and when to hold inventory. It let him anticipate market trends. It gave him the context to understand whether a price offer was fair or exploitative. Most fishermen operated in complete ignorance of market conditions. They knew what the local merchant offered, and that was all. They had no leverage because they had no information. Thorolf had both. The network also provided credit in a more flexible form than the standard Bergen arrangements. If Thorvald needed to make a large purchase, say, buying a boat from a builder in Trondheim, he could arrange for Klaus to provide a letter of credit. This letter would guarantee payment to the builder, backed by the value of fish that Thorolf would deliver to Klaus next season. This credit instrument let Thorolf make investments that would have been impossible with cash alone. The builder in Trondheim trusted Klaus's guarantee even if he did not know Torolf personally. Klaus's reputation was collateral. As the Våger operation grew, Torolf began to extend similar arrangements to other fishermen in his network. A cousin who wanted to build better drying racks could get materials from Torolf on credit, to be repaid in fish or labor. A neighbor who needed help after a bad season could get a loan of flour or cash, to be repaid with interest. Torolf was becoming a banker, a role traditionally held by wealthy merchants or landowners, not by fishermen. This was transgressive. This was changing the social order. People who were supposed to be supplicants were becoming patrons. People who were supposed to borrow were becoming lenders. This shift created resentment among the traditional power holders in the north. The local landlords who had made money renting boats and land to fishermen saw their business declining. The local merchants who had enjoyed captive markets found that fishermen had other options. There were attempts to block the Våger families, to use legal mechanisms or social pressure to constrain them. A landlord might refuse to sell land. A sheriff might suddenly enforce regulations that had been ignored for decades. A priest might preach about the sin of pride and worldly ambition. These were subtle forms of warfare waged by those who saw their power being eroded. The Våger families fought back with money. They made strategic donations to the church, funding a new bell or repairing the roof. They paid their taxes promptly and publicly, removing any excuse for official harassment. They spread their wealth around just enough to create allies. A gift here, a loan there, a favor granted to the right person. They built a defensive network of goodwill that made it harder for enemies to attack them directly. This is the art of managing envy, of being rich without being hated. It requires constant attention and political skill. Torolf was good at it. His sons were less skilled. The physical manifestation of this network was a system of relationships that stretched from Lofoten to Bergen to cities across Europe that the Våger families never saw. When a monk in a monastery in Poland ate fish on Friday, he was eating a fish that might have been caught and dried by Torolf's crews. When a ship captain provisioning for a voyage to the Americas bought Stockfish in Hamburg, he was buying product that had passed through Klaus's warehouse. The Våger families were connected to the global economy of the 17th century in ways that were invisible but real. Their labor and expertise was feeding people across a continent. This was the empire, built not on conquest but on trade, not on force but on quality. But empires are hard to see when you are inside them. Torolf probably did not think of himself as an emperor. He was just a fisherman who had figured out how to do things better. He lived modestly. He worked hard. He worried about storms and markets and family. The grand historical forces and economic systems that we can see from a distance were just the daily details of his life. This is true for all historical actors. They are not aware they are making history. They are just trying to get through the day, to solve the problems in front of them, to provide for their families. The pattern only becomes visible later, when we can step back and see the whole arc. The specific incident that triggered the final rupture between Einar and Halvard happened in the winter of 1651. It was a small thing that revealed a large betrayal. Einar had arranged a marriage between his daughter and the son of another fishing family that the Våger clan was allied with. These marriage alliances were important. They bound families together, created obligations and loyalties, extended the network. The wedding was planned for summer, after the fishing season. It would be a major social event, demonstrating the family's status. Halvard, who was always short of money because of his debts and extravagant spending, made a decision without consulting anyone. He sold a boat that Einar had been counting on for the upcoming season, sold it to pay off a gambling debt. Gambling was forbidden by the church, but widely practiced. Men would bet on everything: weather, fishing results, cards, dice. Halvar had lost heavily and needed cash immediately to avoid public humiliation, so he sold a boat that was technically joint family property. When Einar discovered this, he was enraged, not just about the money, but about the disrespect. Halvar had acted unilaterally, breaking the agreement that major decisions would be made collectively. The boat sale also undermined the wedding plans. Einar had promised the prospective in-laws that the family fleet was strong and growing. Now they would see a boat missing and would hear about the gambling debts. It made the family look weak and unreliable. The marriage was in jeopardy, and marriage alliances were crucial to maintaining power. Einar confronted Halvar publicly, at a meeting of fishermen in the village. This was a calculated choice. Einar wanted everyone to know that Halvar had betrayed the family, that Einar was the responsible one. Public shaming as a tool of family discipline. But it backfired. Halvar, humiliated in front of his peers, responded by revealing secrets that Einar had wanted kept hidden. He talked about how Einar had been skimming profits, taking more than his share. He mentioned a mistress that Einar kept in a nearby town, spending family money on her. He implied that some of the premium fish that Einar claimed were sold to Bergen had actually been sold elsewhere to line Einar's pockets. Whether these accusations were true or exaggerated did not matter. They had been spoken publicly. They could not be unsaid. The family's reputation, so carefully constructed over decades, was damaged. Other fishermen heard the accusations and repeated them. The gossip spread through the community like fire through dried grass. The Bergen merchants heard rumors that the Våger family was fighting internally. This made them wonder if the quality and reliability of the fish would suffer. Klaus, who had been such a loyal partner, became more cautious. He started looking at alternative suppliers, just in case. The marriage alliance fell through. The prospective in-laws withdrew, citing concerns about the family's stability. This was a major blow. It signaled to the community that the Våger family was no longer ascendant. They were vulnerable. And in the brutal social economy of small communities, vulnerability invites attack. People who owed the family money suddenly found reasons to delay payment. People who had been friendly became distant. Alliances that had seemed solid revealed themselves to be transactional and temporary. Einar and Halvar stopped speaking entirely. They communicated through Onfinn, who was exhausted from playing mediator. The family operation, which had required coordination and cooperation, became fractured. Each brother ran his own boats and his own drying operations. They were competing with each other now, driving down prices through their own division. The Bergen merchants played them against each other expertly. Offer one brother a certain price, then tell the other brother he could have a better price if he undercut his sibling. Classic divide and conquer. The Germans had centuries of experience with this tactic. The quality of the fish began to suffer. Not dramatically, but enough. When you are competing with yourself, when you are angry and distracted, when the workers sense chaos and stop caring as much, small details slip. A batch of fish is hung a little too close together. A rack is not checked as frequently. A fish that should be rejected is allowed through because meeting volume targets seems more important than maintaining standards. These minor lapses added up. A merchant in Italy who had always bought Våger fish exclusively received a shipment that was slightly inferior to previous deliveries. He did not complain because standards had not fallen below acceptable levels, but he started looking at competitors. The next time he placed an order, he split it between Våger fish and another supplier. The monopoly on his business was broken. This erosion happened across the customer base. The Våger families still had a strong position, but it was weakening. The premium pricing started to slip. Instead of getting 50% more than competitors, they were getting 20% more, then 10%. At some point, the extra effort required to maintain vulgar standards was not justified by the small premium they could command. This is how competitive advantages disappear, not in a sudden collapse, but in a gradual erosion where each small loss seems manageable, but the cumulative effect is devastating. Numbers tell a story that words sometimes cannot. In 1640, at the peak of their power, the Vogel families produced approximately 80,000 stockfish per year of premium quality. They sold these at an average price 20% higher than market rate. This premium pricing, multiplied across the volume, generated surplus revenue that could be reinvested or accumulated as wealth. The profit margin on stockfish was roughly 40% after accounting for all costs. This meant that the families were clearing 32,000 fish worth of pure profit annually. In terms of purchasing power, this was enough to buy several boats per year, or acquire substantial land holdings, or provide comfortable living for extended family networks. By 1650, after a decade of expansion but also the beginning of internal tensions, production had increased to 100,000 fish per year, but the premium pricing had declined to 10% above market. The profit margin had been squeezed by higher costs, increased competition, and operational inefficiencies from family conflicts. The families were producing more but earning less per unit. Total profit had actually declined despite higher volume. This is the trap of commodity hell. You work harder and harder to maintain revenue while margins compress. By 1655, in the midst of open family warfare, production had fractured. Einar controlled operations, producing 40,000 fish. Halvor controlled 30,000. Arnfinn, who had diversified into other trades, it was producing only 20,000 fish directly, but was trading larger volumes sourced from other fishermen. The premium pricing had disappeared entirely. They were competing on equal terms with dozens of other suppliers. Profit margins had fallen to 20%, barely above subsistence level when divided among the family members. The accumulated wealth was being spent to cover operating losses and personal expenses. The empire was running on fumes. By 1660, total vulgar production had fallen to 60,000 fish across all family members. Multiple boats had been sold to pay debts. Several prime drawing locations had been sold or lost to creditors. The profit margin was essentially zero when you accounted for the debt service. The families were working to pay interest to Bergen merchants who now owned a stake in their operations. They had transitioned from being independent operators to being contract producers, which was the same position that poor fishermen had always occupied. The circle had closed. They were back where they started, except they remembered what it had been like to be rich, which made the poverty more painful. The human cost of this mathematical progression was measured in ruined lives. Einar died essentially bankrupt, his share of the operation mortgaged to creditors. His children inherited debt, not wealth. They had to work off their father's obligations. Some of them left the north entirely, seeking opportunities elsewhere where the family name was not associated with failure. Halvor's gambling and dissolution got worse as his fortunes declined. He drank heavily. There were incidents of violence. He died young, in his 50s, of what was likely liver failure. His children barely remembered him sober. Arnfinn, the survivor, managed to extract himself from the stockfish trade before it completely collapsed. He liquidated his fishing assets at a loss, but walked away with enough capital to start over in Trondheim. He was the only one of Torvald's sons who died without significant debt. The third generation, Torvald's grandchildren, grew up in the shadow of stories about wealth they had never seen. They were told that their grandfather had been important, but their daily reality was ordinary. They were fishermen, clerks, servants, laborers. A few managed to become small merchants or craftsmen. None achieved anything close to the prominence that Thorald had reached. The genetic lottery had not changed. They were just as intelligent and capable as their grandfather. But the circumstances had changed. The window of opportunity had closed. The structural conditions that allowed for rapid wealth accumulation no longer existed. This generational decline is common enough to be a cliché. Rags to rags in 3 generations. But the cliché exists because the pattern is real. The first generation builds through deprivation and obsession. The second generation maintains through discipline and luck. The third generation lacks the hunger and the knowledge and the circumstances. By the fourth generation, the connection to the original success is so attenuated that it is meaningless. You are just another person trying to make your way in the world. And the fact that your great-great-grandfather was once important is trivia, not advantage. Long after the Vogel families had faded into ordinariness, the physical structures they had built remained. The HL racks, those skeletal cathedrals of commerce, did not disappear immediately. Wood rots slowly in the Arctic cold. The poles they had driven into the rocky ground stayed firm for decades. Other families, other fishermen, used these structures, maintained them, added to them. The specific engineering innovations that the Vogel families had developed, the spacing and the orientation and the construction techniques, became standard practice throughout Lofoten. The knowledge had leaked, yes, but it had also been absorbed. It became common property. This is how technological progress works. The pioneer takes the risk and reaps temporary rewards. Then the innovation diffuses and everyone benefits. By 1700, the Lofoten coast was covered with drying racks that looked remarkably similar to the Vogel originals. An outside observer would not have been able to tell which structures had been built by the Stockfish barons and which were later imitations. The form had separated from its creators. It had become archetypal. If you wanted to dry fish efficiently in Lofoten, you built your racks a certain way. Everyone knew this. No one remembered who had figured it out first. The same pattern held for the Bergen trade networks. The relationships that Claus and Thorolf had pioneered, the model of direct negotiation between producers and merchants with quality premiums and mixed payment terms, became standard. Other fishermen demanded similar arrangements. The Bergen merchants, having seen that this model worked, extended it more widely. By the early 1800s, the trade was formalized into something resembling a modern commodity exchange, with standardized grades, fixed prices, and transparent transactions. The secrecy and personal relationships that had characterized the early Vogel-Claus connection were replaced by institutions and rules. This was progress. In a sense, it was fairer and more efficient, but it was also more boring. The towns that the Vogel families had helped develop continued to grow. Svolvær became the administrative capital of Lothringen. By the 19th century, it had a population of several thousand year-round residents. There were shops, churches, schools, government offices. Young people from fishing families could get education and pursue careers beyond fishing. The economic base had diversified. Stockfish was still important, but it was not the only industry. This diversification created stability and resilience. When fishing was bad, people had alternatives. The community was not entirely dependent on a single resource. The irony is that the Vogel families had wanted to maintain monopoly, but their real legacy was democratization. By proving that stockfish could be a path to prosperity, They inspired countless others to enter the trade. By developing techniques that worked brilliantly, they created knowledge that eventually spread to everyone. By building infrastructure, they reduced barriers to entry for future generations. Everything they did to entrench their own position ultimately undermined it by showing others that success was possible. This is the dialectic of capitalism. Competition destroys individual advantage, but creates collective abundance. The descendants of the Stockfish barons, scattered across Norway by the 20th century, mostly did not think about their ancestry. A fisherman in modern Lofoten working on a trawler with sonar and hydraulic nets might be a direct descendant of Thorald and not know it. A clerk in a Trondheim office processing fish export documents might carry the genes of Halvar or Einar without being aware of the connection. The past is not carried forward in consciousness. It is carried forward in institutions, in practices, in the subtle ways that culture shapes behavior across generations. Occasionally, a local historian would trace family lines and publish articles about the old families of Lofoten. These articles would mention the Våger clan, noting that they were significant fish merchants in the 17th century. The language would be wry, academic. Names and dates, property transfers, trade volumes. The drama and human cost would be absent, compressed into footnotes. This is how history gets recorded. The complexity of lived experience gets reduced to data points that fit into tables and charts. The emotions, the conflicts, the triumphs and betrayals, all of that is lost or at best implied. But walk along the coast of Lofoten in winter, even now, and you will see their ghost. The racks still stand, though most are now on commercial properties operated by companies rather than families. The fish still hang drying in the wind. The smell is the same. The process is fundamentally unchanged despite modern materials and techniques. The scrays still come in their millions. The wind still blows. The cold still preserves. The basic economic logic that Thoralf understood 500 years ago is still operating. Take abundance and make it permanent. Transform perishability into durability. Use the environment as a tool rather than fighting against it. This is the true legacy. Not family wealth, not personal glory, but a template, a proven model, a demonstration that mastery is possible. The Stockfish barons showed that it could be done. They showed that geography was not destiny. They showed that clever people using simple tools and natural processes could compete with the most sophisticated merchants of Europe. They showed that knowledge was power, that quality mattered, that attention to detail created value. These lessons were absorbed into the culture of the North. They became part of how people thought about their work and their possibilities. And that, finally, is how transformation becomes permanent. Not by maintaining individual advantage, that always erodes, but by changing the collective understanding of what is possible. The Vogel families lifted themselves out of poverty through innovation. They fell back because of their own failures and the inevitable forces of competition. But in the process, they lifted the entire region slightly. They made the pie bigger. They showed everyone that there was another way. The next generation did not have to replicate their monopoly to benefit from their example. They just had to fish well and dry carefully and sell smartly. The formula was available. The secret had leaked. And that leak, that loss of private knowledge into public domain, was ultimately more valuable than the temporary fortune it had generated for one family. This is the final alchemical transformation. Private gold into public lead. Yes, but also private lead into public gold. The knowledge that let the Våger families escape poverty was locked in their heads and their hands. When it spread, it lost value to them personally, but gained value to society. The total wealth generated by thousands of fishermen using Våger techniques exceeded by orders of magnitude of the wealth that the Vogler families had accumulated. This is the paradox of innovation. The innovator rarely captures more than a tiny fraction of the total value created. Most of it spills over. And that spillover is the real story, the real achievement, the real reason we remember the Stockfish barons centuries after their personal fortune vanished. They turned ice into gold, yes, but more importantly, they showed everyone else how to do it. And then, whether they wanted to or not, they watched as their monopoly dissolved and their secret became common knowledge. They fought to prevent this. They failed. And in failing, they succeeded at something larger than they had imagined. They became teachers. Unwilling teachers, perhaps, but teachers nonetheless. The lesson they taught, that mastery of harsh environments is possible, that natural forces can be harnessed, that poverty is not inevitable, echoes still in the cold wind blowing across the Lofoten Islands.